This is the Latin News Podcast. I'm your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. I'm very happy to introduce, an absolute expert in the field discussing Panama and, issues from this region. It's former U.S. career diplomat and ambassador, John Feeley. Welcome on the Latin News Podcast.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's an absolute pleasure to talk with someone of this prestige here on the Latin News Podcast. You are, of course, a 28-year State Department career professional, a former Marine officer and helicopter pilot, and indeed former ambassador to Panama. And that's about which we're going to speak today. Panama and, of course, the United States have been making the headlines a little bit. And before we launch into maybe some of the more controversial things that have been said by the current president in the United States, perhaps we could take a little bit of historical context between Panama and the United States regarding diplomatic tensions.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start right at the very beginning. 1903, the Hemisphere Treaty. Panama would not exist if it were not for the United States. Mm-hmm. At a moment of historical imperialism, the United States, under William McKinley, decides to revive a centuries-old, Hernan Cortez and Balboa, the original Spanish conquistadores, figured out that the easiest way to get by water from the Caribbean to the Pacific was to go through Panama, the small isthmus. The French tried in the 1880s and 90s, failed, and that idea of expansionism, imperialism, is really brought to its fruition in the face of it for the American people and in American history is Teddy Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. So the canal is built. Roosevelt does some amazing public diplomacy. He's the very first president to travel outside the United States while he's a sitting president. And where does he go? He goes to Panama. And what's going on in Panama? Well, they're running into real trouble building this canal. And we won't go into the technical details of it, but I'd highly recommend to anybody to read David McCullough's Path Between the Seas. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt gets into a Pittsburgh steel backhoe and in a white suit and the Panama hat that everybody knows, he's working that thing and he's digging out hard stone from the Galliard Cut, and the canal is finished 1914. Teddy doesn't get to inaugurate it, but it represents American imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century. From that time on, the United States and Panama have been inextricably linked. Now, for about 60 years, right? I would say 60 years, the canal is not a commercial waterway. It is a strategic waterway. If you go back and you take a look at why Teddy Roosevelt got McKinley and others to push it, he had been Secretary of the Navy. He's very influenced by a guy named Alfred Mahan, who has this whole theory of sea power as national power projection. It was all about U.S. Navy ships going through the canal to get from the shipyards on the east coast of the United States out to the Pacific in the most expeditious fashion. It's a tremendous success. The United States, literally under international law and a treaty, is the sovereign governor of about a 5 mile on either side of the canal path stretch of Panamanian land. And, when I was ambassador, I used to say this very openly. It was an apartheid system. Apartheid being a purposeful exclusion of one people from an area where those inside that area have exceptional privileges. That was the canal zone. But I have to say, a lot like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, it was, as far as apartheids go, it was pretty benign. And the Panamanians worked on the canal, but the Americans ran it. But it wasn't run as a commercial venture. It wasn't a highway toll for the sea the way it is today. In 1968, no one less than Henry Kissinger, the grand old man, the hawk of American realpolitik, writes a memo to Richard Nixon, and he says, hey, boss, this Panama Canal thing, it's really kicking our ass. All the Latins hate it. The Panamanians hate it. Everyone else has decolonized. Great Britain has decolonized in the Caribbean, and we're still flying the stars and stripes over Ancon Hill in Panama. Nixon says, yeah, you're right, but you know what? It's political suicide here, and he buries it. Fast forward a few more years, Jimmy Carter comes in, and Jimmy Carter makes an amazingly brave political decision against popular will in the United States, as expressed primarily by the Republican Party. Jimmy Carter recognizes that it is in the United States long-term self-interest. It's not charity. It's not Mother Teresa. It's not giving alms to the poor. It's a recognition in 1977 that, hey, we have bicoastal fleets. We have the Sixth Fleet on the East Coast. We have the Fourth Fleet based out of Louisiana. We got the Seventh Fleet out in PACOM, Pacific Command, based off the West Coast. We don't need it as much as we did in past years. And on top of it, it's like this superating soar of just burbling Panamanian nationalism. And Panamanians are among the least nationalistic people I know in Latin America. But, nobody wants a foreign power, a foreign sovereign in their backyard, least of all dividing the backyard, which is exactly what the Panama Canal does. So the diplomatic history of the United States in Panama, I would best describe as required friendship with a lot of tension. And when Jimmy Carter signs the treaty, it really takes off into genuine friendship, partnership. Now, let's not make any mistakes. It's a totally asymmetrical power relationship. United States is 335 million people. Panama is 4 million people. The GDPs don't even compare. I couldn't do the math to figure out the fraction. But Panama remains mostly democratic. Panama remains a staunch U.S. ally in the Cold War. And until Manuel Noriega comes along in the 1980s, Panama is a reliable U.S. friend and partner. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the history up to Manuel Noriega. Noriega is a 5 to 6 year blip. As everybody knows, Noriega starts out life as a young colonel being trained by the Americans. He becomes a CIA asset. And then, as they call him in Panama, El Man, Manuel Antonio Noriega, El Man goes bad. And El Man is now dealing drugs and letting Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel land their planes, as that enterprising Colombian figures out that the best way to introduce cocaine to the United States is to fly planes low and slow over the Caribbean and launch them into Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport just north of Miami. And we have the 1980s and the cocaine cowboy issues. But Manuel Noriega commits the the mortal sin of Latin American dictators. And go back to the rather cynical view that, yeah, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, referring to Anastasio Somoza. But he may be a son of a bitch, but he is now an openly non-democratic and anti-American son of a bitch. And so in 1989, after a lot of provocations, keep in mind that the treaty has been signed 12 years earlier. Mm-hmm. So the United States and Panama had, and the people who did it, the negotiator, Ellsworth Bunker, Gabriel Lewis Galindo, these are genuine statesmen. These are people who have a really good understanding of the historical context. They sign a treaty. They actually signed two treaties, one the Neutrality Treaty, the other the Canal Treaty, not only to revert, and actually revert's the wrong word because Panama never had sovereign control over the canal, but to transfer sovereign control over the canal and the canal zone. But what do? They give themselves the benefit of time. 22 years. They set the date for the transfer in 1977. And once it's ratified by the U.S. Senate by one vote, by the way, it was highly unpopular. And Ronald Reagan always said that he won the 1980 election in part because Jimmy Carter gave the canal back, words that Donald Trump echoes today. And so they're 12 years into this 22-year transition period. And now they got this guy who's openly threatening Americans in the Canal Zone. And keep in mind, we still had about 40, 50,000 troops stationed there because the U.S. Southern Command is located in the Canal Zone. And George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, makes the decision, we're taking out Noriega. And so we have the December 20, 1989 invasion. It's a fascinating, fascinating little microcosm of American diplomacy and war diplomacy in a sense, because Colin Powell is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. Brent Scowcroft is the National Security Advisor. And again, people that I look to as true visionaries and statesmen and warriors who understood the nature of power. This is the first place we see the Powell Doctrine employed. If you're going to go in with your military, it's got to be the last choice. You try everything beforehand. And when you go in with overwhelming power, you achieve your clearly delineated military objectives, and then you get the hell out of there and you go back home. And that is exactly what they did. So 1989, you have the invasion. 1990, the United States says to Panama, all right, guys, you're on your own. See how you can do with your democracy. We stick around. We provide a lot of money. But Panama, over the next 30 years, becomes a normal country in the sense that there's no canal, there's no sovereign American presence, and it remains an overwhelmingly pro-U.S. society. Culturally, there is nothing like Panama in the region. It looks like Miami and Panama City. You hear English spoken, although not quite as much as you used to be honest, once you get outside of Panama City. But they play baseball instead of soccer, although their soccer team's getting actually quite good and just beat the U.S.
Just beat the U.S., yeah.
Just beat the U.S. But they eat turkey on Thanksgiving. For goodness sake. I mean, there is a cult. I used to, when I was ambassador there, I would go out and there were Kiwanis touch football leagues, American football. It's the same as you see wherever you had a long-term presence of American soldiers. You have two things. You have baseball, you have football, actually three things. You have baseball, you have football, and you have a lot of prostitutes. And so Panama had them too. But it's a very benign environment in which the United States and U.S. business and U.S. military and U.S. diplomatic services work. And Panamanians were the shining star for the first 20 years of this decade in terms of what they did with their own economic growth and things like that. They weren't without problems, but it was always an exceptionally fluid relationship. Decades of first name basis of ambassadors with assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, family friendships that have continued through generations. So it's a really, really unique place. And we'll see if it's come to a parteaguas, a tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell likes to call them.
It's certainly, I mean, it's such a fascinating history and such a recent history. And of course, you're so very involved in it, having been, 2000, up until 2018, you were ambassador there in Panama. From your position now, looking at what's going on currently, and we'll get into this even deeper, but I mean, just that one phrase by President Trump that Panama was a bad deal for the U.S. How did you react to that when you heard it?
Well, I obviously reject that notion, but I understand why Donald Trump says that. Donald Trump, and I think this requires me to, sort of borrow what I've read about him. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I don't pretend to look into the eyes of Donald Trump and know his soul the way Bush 43 did Vladimir Putin. But Donald Trump's life trajectory indicates to me that he is who he is. He's a real estate guy from an outer borough in New York where I grew up. He is a very literal thinker, and he believes that if he can't see it in his checkbook or walk into it with his name on top of it, it's not a good deal. It's not an asset. And so what he fundamentally rejects in his own, to the extent he has a concept of foreign affairs, is he does not ascribe any value to a long-standing friendship and trust-based alliance, which is precisely what we had cultivated with Panama and the Panamanians with us as willing partners since the canal was transferred back in 1990 or 1989 on the last day. So he looks at that, and he's not alone. Let's be very frank. He's not alone. Ronald Reagan said it was a bad deal. There are lots of people in his MAGA coalition today. I talked with a good friend of mine last night who I went to high school with. He says, why the hell did Carter give that thing back? We built it. We owned it. And again, my answer to it is because in our own enlightened self-interest, we should realize, we should be capable of realizing that instead of a master servant or senior partner, junior partner, power relationship, our interests are better served if we have a willing, able, and capable partner. And that's what we had in Panama. But Trump fundamentally rejects that. And so therefore he says, bad deal. Jimmy Carter was a weak president. You know, Jimmy Carter didn't give that thing up because anybody put a gun to his head. It's because his own advisors and Henry Kissinger had previously said, guys, the Panama Canal is becoming, you know, this bubbling cauldron of seething anti-Americanism. That ain't good for business in a Cold War where we're trying to win hearts and minds and we're trying to play proxy war chess with the Soviets. And, you know, the fact is the Soviets never got a foothold in Panama. And that is not true of the neighbors to the north in Central America. So again, it's just fundamentally different concepts as to what constitutes value in your foreign affairs.
And you mentioned this proxy chess game, obviously in the Cold War. Are we playing a proxy chess game right now? What's going on? China and obviously the US, the Panama Canal and so on?
I don't know if we're playing chess, if we're playing checkers, or if we just sort of threw the dice, but we're playing a game where there's not a lot of clear strategy behind it. I do believe, look, be very frank, Richard, in 2017, when then President Juan Carlos Varela recognized China, surprised us, had lied to me directly when I asked him 2 months earlier. Not the first or last time an American ambassador will be lied to, and certainly not something to get terribly upset about, other than the fact that I said to him, if you guys are thinking of naturally of recognizing Beijing, you know, as a friend, as a long-standing treaty alliance partner, you're a sovereign nation. We're not telling you what to do, but don't surprise us. Friends don't surprise friends, right? And they did, and you know, it was a whole caveat emptor sort of scenario. And what I got at that time was nothing. This is June 2017. The President Trump's first administration is about 6 months in, and I couldn't get anybody to pay attention because the concern that I had then is the same concern I have today, but it is now a concern that is shared by the Trump team. And that is the nature of Chinese commercial expansion, not just in Panama, but throughout Latin America. And the idea that when the Chinese show up, they show up with a lot of easy money for infrastructure, which is something these nations clearly need and want. But unlike the Americans who show up with a whole bunch of pesky human rights, democracy, and you know, environmental strings attached to the money, the Chinese show up with corrupt business practices, with all kinds of violations of labor and environmental rules. You take a look in Argentina in Nequén, you know, they got an orbital space station down there, and Argentines aren't allowed through the gate. I mean, it's not a good long-term partner, but it is a very good short-term transactional partner for individual governments and people who get rich off of their deals, which sadly, tragically, quite frankly, is the way Donald Trump sees the world. So the fact that he's railing against China today, I actually don't have a problem with. I do have a problem with the way in which he's characterized China's involvement in the canal And that bears some, a little bit of geek canal sort of explanation. The Panama Canal has 5 ports. Those ports are concessions. They are not owned, the land is not owned by the companies that run the ports. Of the 5, 2 are the concessions were granted via an international bid process in 1997 when the U.S. was still in charge. 2 years, or 19, I'm sorry, 97. U.S. is still in charge. Hutchison, Whampoa, subsidiary of C.K. Hutchison, Hong Kong-based company, they get the concession. They run ports. Okay, now 2 things you got to keep in mind. In 1997, the Chinese government in Beijing was not what it is today. And Hong Kong was most certainly not what it is today. There really wasn't any concern. Jesse Helms made a little bit of noise. He was a very conservative American senator about the Chinese being down in Panama, and it was almost stereotypical kind of joke thing. And the Panamanians diffused it beautifully. They sent up the first canal administrator, a guy named Alberto Alemán. He was an engineer trained in the United States, went up, testified before the Congress, and he made it very clear that Chinese ain't running the canal. Fast forward, 3 more ports. One is operated by an American company, one is operated by a Taiwan company, and one is operated by a Singapore port operator. Ports don't control a canal. They don't open the gates. They don't guide the big super tankers in. Those are all Panamanians. They all exclusively work for something called the ACP, the Panama Canal Authority. They are all Panamanian citizens. But what can those ports do? So Marco Rubio said, well, in wartime, they could block the canal. No, sorry, Marco, they can't. But what they can do, what they could do, and I can't go into it here, but trust me, we have an entire IC, we like to call it, the intelligence community, that watches this stuff pretty closely. They could use those 2 ports on either ends of the canal, and the other ports are on either end of the canal too, let me just stress. They're not the only ones out there. There's no point in having a port in the middle of the canal. So they're all on the either side of the canal. The way it's framed in current discussions with President Trump is, Chinese control both ends of the canal, so they could shut it down. That's just ignorance speaking. That's just logistically impossible. But what can they do? They could use it to spy, industrial espionage. They could put scanners, sensors. They could have individuals in the management structure of the company who are dual use, meaning they are trained spies reporting back to Hong Kong. They could, take images of certain ships as they go through. So it's not completely unfounded. What is completely unfounded, and I believe counterproductive, is the manner in which Donald Trump has gone about this. And so that's where we are today. And he is saying that we are going to take back the canal.
Yeah, and also the commentary that the Chinese soldiers along the canal. In the last 3 years, I've been through a dozen times, if at least. I don't recall ever seeing a Chinese soldier, along the pipeline.
Here, I'll say this in my native Bronx dialect so that President Trump hopefully understands it. There ain't no goddamn Chinese soldiers marching up and down the canal. Period.
There you go. But it's really a sign of the times that we have to seriously consider the possibility of a President Trump ordering an invasion of a democratic ally. Is there actually sort of a legal case that Panama is in violation of this Carta Torrijos treaty when it was signed off? Is there a legal case?
What's really interesting about, I guess now we're going on about 6 weeks ago here in the United States, Senator Ted Cruz held a hearing in the Senate Commerce Committee. And one of the invited witnesses was an Israeli law professor. And this Israeli law professor made what I consider to be, and I'm not a lawyer, but I spent plenty of time around him, and a lot of it is plain English, made this case that because of the potential dual use nature of a port concession that it could be interpreted under the neutrality treaty that Panama had violated the treaty by allowing a Chinese company based in Hong Kong to have the two concessions for the two of the 5 ports. Now, if you accept that, then you would in my mind, you would by inference have to assume that there is Singapore influence, Taiwan influence, and US influence, because the other 3 ports are operated by companies from those countries. I found it to be specious, paper thin, and absolutely unwarranted as legal analysis. And to the best of my knowledge, he was a very well-spoken guy. He had a very nice RP accent. He'd obviously been educated in Great Britain, and he went on at deep length about the treaty and codicil number 4 in paragraph 7. But the bottom line is both the United States and Panama, under the neutrality treaty, have the right and the responsibility to make unilateral decisions. And there is no treaty stipulation that says they got to sit down, put their heads together and go, okay, is there undue foreign influence in the canal? And it's never happened. And the fact is that we have had presidents from both parties since 1999. Nobody has ever suggested that there is undue foreign influence or preferential treatment given to the ships of any nation in the canal. And my firm personal belief is that that's not occurring today. Having with the caveat that I was concerned in 2017, I am concerned still today about what China might be doing in terms of industrial espionage with those 2 port concessions. But do I believe that there has been a violation of the neutrality treaty? No, not at all.
And of course, as you said, Trump, a literal thinker. Everything's a bad deal. The US is being taken for a ride when it comes to the tariffs or the prices that ships are. I'm sure they're universally priced on weight.
Now, that's one of the biggest fallacies. I think that's a very nice word for fake news. That's one of the biggest fallacies that Donald Trump has been putting out there. First of all, keep in mind that Donald Trump I don't believe he's a very educated man, but he is not without a certain reptilian intelligence. And I think very frequently he uses what is, according to an AI analysis of his speech, the diction of a 4th grader. He uses it to his advantage. He is a very good communicator to a certain public here in the United States. It includes a lot of echolalia, where he repeats things over and over. It includes horrible syntax and grammar, but he knows how to hit certain points that resonate. So one of the things he says, and has said since December 22nd, I think it was, when he first raised the Panama Canal. Keep in mind, this is one of the really interesting things going on. This guy can keep a secret. He ran an entire campaign and never mentioned Panama.
Yeah.
He gets elected, and all of a sudden, we're here in Panama and Greenland. Americans are going to the Google search to go, where the hell are these places? And he's going and repeating this line, and I have heard educated Americans repeat it to me. Well, we're getting ripped off. Our ships are getting ripped off down there, man. The guy's gouging us. Okay, let's stop and deconstruct that. Number one, the world's international commercial shipping fleet is not American. The United States has a merchant marine, meaning ships that fly an American flag on the high seas, of about 60 vessels. There are over 10,000 of these horizontal skyscrapers plying the ocean blue. They're overwhelmingly made the ships are made in countries that subsidize a shipping industry. And the flags are flags of convenience. Panama is the largest flag of convenience. What that means is they simply register their ship. They comply with basic maritime safety and regulatory rules. Liberia is another one, and the countries make money off them. This has been par for the course. You could argue, well, that doesn't seem right. Yeah, but it's what maritime shipping has developed over the last 30, 40 years, when it really began to go on steroids at the beginning of modern globalization. So the US doesn't have commercial ships to be ripped off or price gouged in the first place. What Trump means is that the containers that float on them, the TEUs, the 20-foot equivalent units that are stacked 7,000 high on a ship that can fit through the original locks, stacked 14,000 high on the new locks, which were expanded at Panama's expense between 2008, 2016, when the new locks were inaugurated. 70% of those TEUs, those shipping containers, either originate from or go to, are destined to a U.S. port, which means the stuff inside of them is, in fact, used by Americans or sold by Americans. So we are 70%. We are by far the largest user of the canal in a commercial sense, but not in a strict shipping sense. And if you were to sort of break down how much extra your iPhone in Philadelphia costs because it floated through the Panama Canal, you are literally talking about fractions of a cent. The way the tariffs are established is world-class transparency. The board, and this is a really important point for listeners to keep in mind, the Panama Canal is not the Panamanian government. The Panama Canal Authority, by design, set up with the Americans as we planned the transition for 22 years, is a completely independent entity from the Panamanian government. In point of fact, it has become the cash cow of the Panamanian government. In 2023, there were over $5 billion in revenues collected by the Panamanian toll booth, let's call it. 2.5 of it went to the operations and maintenance of the toll booth, and $2.5 billion in a country of only 4 million people got deposited in the exchequer of the Panamanian government. Not a bad deal. So it has been an amazingly successful commercial venture for Panama. But who are the real beneficiaries of this, Richard? It's me. I live in D.C. on the East Coast. If I bought a large screen TV in the last 10 years, it floated through the Panama Canal, and I got it at the lowest cost of transportation possible. Because if they dumped that large screen TV made in Fujian province in California, loaded it onto a train, shipped it on 2 train cars out to the nearest depot, then put it on a trailer truck for the last tactical mile into my Walmart or Costco, where I went and bought it, the cost would be higher per unit because the transportation costs are higher. So it's a simple capitalist. I mean, there's one thing Panamanians are good at. They're good capitalists. And this is the most cost-efficient way to ship goods from East Asia to the East Coast of the United States and to Latin America, I will also.
And to Latin America.
Yeah.
There's one thing that keeps popping up in my mind, and I keep thinking back to 1989 and the invasion, and you being a Marine Corps officer and former helicopter pilot. What is the reality? I mean, how is it? Is the idea of a second operation just cause, as it was called back in 1989, is it entirely impractical? Could you see it happening from a military perspective?
Okay, let's split the conversation. I'm going to hold back on the joke as to what we call this operation. I hope they don't plan it on signal. But let's split the notion of, is it possible in a strategic, military, kinetic conversation, and is it possible from a political reality conversation? The first, no question. The United States has such overwhelmingly asymmetrically powerful military that we could easily invade Panama again. Panama doesn't even have a military. Panama has a relatively professional police force that's divided into 3 divisions. The police who do the same sort of thing that, bobbies in London do and New York City cops do. They keep order with the civilian population. They have a border police called Front. That's what mostly looks like an infantry and protects their borders. Excuse me, they do all of the work down in the Darien, et cetera. And they have a tiny, tiny Coast Guard and it includes an aviation wing. Mm-hmm. But Panama, by its own self-determination, its people's will, after Manuel Noriega in 1989, when he finally got removed, they decided they didn't want to have a military service, same as Costa Rica. Mm-hmm. So could the United States do it? Absolutely. No questions asked. It'd be a weekend's task. However, and this is a big however, when I was the ambassador, and even before then, we used to run an annual exercise called Panamax, mm-hmm. which was to defend the canal. And we would sit down with our Panamanian counterparts, and we would invite regional militaries. And I'm going to ask you to just stop the recording or just edit it out. I don't know what the hell happened, but I'm like choking here.
Take your time.
Thanks. I'm getting all worked up here.
Oh boy.
All right, let me go back.
Mm-hmm. Panamax.
When I was the U.S. ambassador, I participated in something called the Panamax annual exercise. This is an exercise where the United States Southern Command, working with Panama's police force and regional partners as well, would analyze various threats to the canal. And we would look at things like a terrorist attack to sabotage the canal. We would look at things like white powder incidents when those were a thing. And every year there was a new scenario. And it was classic military wargaming. Blue cell, red cell, how do you react, things like that. It was one of the ways that the United States and Panama built this exceptionally good relationship as strategic partners to protect the canal. The going-in assumption was always that if the United States had to intervene to protect the neutrality of the canal under the Neutrality Treaty, it would take 100,000 boots on the ground to invade and to hold. Keep in mind, 1989, we already had about 40 to 50,000 troops on the ground there already because Southern Command was still there. Today, Southern Command is located in Doral, Florida, in the outskirts of Miami. 100,000 boots on the ground. So think about this. We have just finished, we the United States have just finished a cycle of over 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. 6,000, more than 6,000 dead soldiers, seamen, airmen, Marines. Untold dozens of thousands of people with traumatic brain injury. If you go to a mall on the outskirts of a city or a state where there is a large military base, you will see literally the walking wounded. You will see young women, young men in wheelchairs, quadriplegics with traumatic brain injury, missing eyes. You will see the costs of what war in Afghanistan and Iraq meant. And what do we get for it? Not a lot. And most Americans, to include, and especially to include, MAGA supporters, blamed Washington's Pentagon, State Department, national security authorities for getting us involved in a war in a place few could find on a map. And who fights our wars? I'll be very frank. They are not the Ivy League elites who are protesting against Gaza. They are the sons and daughters of MAGA voters. We have the largest recruitment of young people into our military forces, where I once served, from 7 states. And with the exception of California, they are all red states. So I sort of put it back on Donald Trump, who very wisely is, again, speaking with that fourth grader's diction and not being specific. He has said, I don't think troops are going to be involved. I don't think we need to do that. But all options are on the table. The military is on the table. I don't think he has the votes, bottom line. I don't think he's got the MAGA support to start a new war in Panama and to keep 100,000 people in uniform there, patrolling, protecting, because, again, Panama, they're not going to be able to resist our overwhelming military force. But wait till we start to see what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. Small guerrilla wars, the first casualty that comes back who's killed. This is what triggered 1989, for goodness sakes, when they started to attack U.S. uniformed service members. Manuel Antonio Noriega declared a state of war on the United States and killed a young soldier, Zach Hernandez. That's the sort of thing that I think even Donald Trump is capable of understanding. And he has said in his inaugural speech, I want to be known as the peacemaker. I think, and this is not to give him credit, but I think in a kind of mafia boss way, he understands that war is bad for business. You don't want to be fighting all the time because you're not making money. And he looks at war as something that you threaten, and he's got the biggest, baddest war machine on the planet right now. So you threaten it, but you don't actually pull that trigger.
Very interesting. And on the other side, I feel that President Molino in Panama has been acting very pragmatically towards Marco Rubio and Donald Trump.
You know, I think that Molino, perhaps inadvertently, is writing the manual on how you deal with this guy. I think there are a lot of leaders throughout Latin America that are sort of sitting there taking notes in the sense that he has said what he's had to say, just like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, right? The Panama Canal is not for sale. The Panama Canal is not going to be transferred out of Panamanian sovereign control. He has to say that. He has said that repeatedly. But what hasn't he done? He hasn't fought Donald Trump on Donald Trump's preferred battleground, which is in social media. He's issued a couple of statements. He's made a couple of statements. They're usually in response. But, you know, there have been a couple of times where Trump has made some statements and Molino has chosen to be quiet. Why? Because back channel, there is furious negotiating going on. And the Panamanians are figuring out a way to placate Trump, let him claim victory, and not lose sovereign control. That, I think, is a very pragmatic, and, you know, I've said this before, and a couple of friends of mine always sort of laugh at me when I say it, but, you know, you want to figure this out? Go back to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. The great lesson out of the Peloponnesian War is the Melian dialogues. And I'm not going to go into the whole long thing, but it is a really fascinating vision where Athenian generals showed up on this prosperous little island one day and said, hey, you guys weren't paying tribute under Sparta. Guess what? We're in charge now. You're going to pay tribute. Think Tony Soprano shaking down a butcher, you know? And the Melians have all these great arguments. Why? No. It's not in your interest for us to pay tribute. Because that way, see, we can deliver you the goods at a cheaper price. And they make all these great economic arguments. And the Athenians are like, no, I don't think you're hearing me. You're going to start paying tribute tomorrow. And so the dialogues end. The Athenians go away. They don't pay tribute. The next day, the Athenians show up. They kill all the men. They rape all the women. They throw the kids in the sea. And from that 2,500-year-old Thucydides lesson, we get the famous dictum, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must suffer. And that's what's happening here. So I think, I don't know if Jose Raul Molino has read Thucydides, but he's clearly internalized the lesson. And he knows that he can't fight fire with fire because he ain't got no fire. He doesn't have a big lighter. But what does he have? He has a way to allow Donald Trump to claim victory by investigating the Hutchison contract extensions in 2021, where it's almost undeniable there was money passed under the table. I will allow his controlador, the equivalent of their sort of, you know, government watchdog, to determine that, but that's pretty much the rumor on the streets in Panama. A couple guys got paid off, and in 2021, instead of going to an open concession bid the way it had been done in 1997 for 25 years when Hutchison won the concession, right? Because ports are big infrastructure. You don't do this on a year-by-year basis. This isn't like renting a 2-bedroom apartment. So what they do is they don't put it up, and they just do an amendment to the contract. Mm-hmm. And there is a case right now in Panamanian courts that says that's unconstitutional. That violated the organic law of the ACP. It violated Panamanian law, contractual law. I'm not the expert on this, so I'll wait and see what happens. But that's Molino's solution. We're going to get rid of Hutchison by showing there were irregularities in the extension of that contract. Mm-hmm. Trump comes back and says, no, that's not good enough, because that's going to take too long. And then, as we now know, as has been reported in the press, Larry Fink of BlackRock puts together a 3-company consortium, including BlackRock, world's largest private equity fund, a company out of Switzerland that also invests, it's a fund that invests in infrastructure called TIL, and then very importantly, guys who actually know something about running a port, MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company. And so they announced, and I guess it's been about 2 weeks now, they announced for $23.3 billion, they announced that they are going to purchase from CK Hutchison the concession for the ports of Balboa and Cristobal, and, oh, by the way, ports around the world, to include Felixstowe in Suffolk, England, to include ports that Hutchison, they basically divest themselves of their port business, except for the ports in Hong Kong and mainland China. And this is, I believe, a pretty darn elegant solution. Now, whether Molino and Trump both got lucky, I don't know. But remember, Jack Nicklaus, the famous golfer, once said, "I'd rather be lucky than good any day of the week."
I think, yes, it does seem to be coming up a lot that not engaging with Trump on social media seems to be the way forward. A lesson perhaps learned by President Petro here in Colombia a few weeks ago in January, but let's not go into that. Ambassador John, it has been incredible listening to your insights and your profound knowledge of what's going on in Panama, and of course putting into the context with the current US political arena. And I mean, it must have been so hard to have left Panama in 2018, because everything I've read is it shows you had a truly profound affection for the people and for the country. In 2018, you brought it to a close. Political differences, I believe. Perhaps you could tell us how that happened.
Yeah, sure. My decision to retire from my professional career as a diplomat, as a career diplomat, an apolitical diplomat. And what that means is, it didn't mean that I don't have political leanings. Every human being has their political leanings. But when you join the Foreign Service, you literally sign an oath that says that you will implement the president's policies wherever you are, in whatever billet you may be serving, to the very best of your abilities. And that even if you disagree with them, we do have internal dissent channels that have been used over years, abused as well. And I'd always been able to do it. There were policies I didn't like. I thought our Cuba policy was ridiculous and anachronistic, just throwback that was dominated by a small cadre of very dedicated Congress people in the United States. But I never questioned the motives behind their desired end state. The strategic tactics that they employed, sanctioning, diplomatic isolation in Cuba, cutting off all ties, travel restrictions. After 60 years, my entire life basically, I thought they were counterproductive to continue, because what's that great, I think it's a Ionesco or a Sartre line, the definition, no, maybe it's Einstein. Definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome.
I think it's Einstein.
Maybe Einstein, I don't know. I'm certainly not Einstein, but I can quote him on occasion when it serves my purpose. Kind of like C.S. Lewis once said, the devil can quote scripture for his own purpose. In any event, but I never thought that any Republican president or even the assistant secretaries and secretaries of state who served Republican presidents during my lifetime ever had anything other than a genuine desire to see the Cuban people exercise their right to self-determination, hold elections, be reincorporated into democratic community and nations, begin to trade again. I just fundamentally disagreed with their tactics. And then conversely, I fundamentally agreed with President Obama's tactic. Didn't mean that we were coddling the Castros or Miguel Diaz-Canel or anything like that. It just meant we were using a different tactic, the tactic of engagement vice isolation to get what we wanted, which is what foreign policy is all about, getting the other guys to do what you want. In the case of Donald Trump and my own career, my decision to resign and end my career had absolutely nothing to do with Panama. It had to do with my personal and unstated rejection of his campaign rhetoric against migrants. I'd been privileged to spend almost 7 years of my career in 2 different stays in Mexico. I didn't like the way he talked about migrants. I myself am from migrant stock. My grandparents were immigrants from Italy and Ireland and, James Joyce's Floor Sweepings of Europe in New York, right? They all meet in the Catholic Church, and a couple generations later, I pop out. And I'm nothing more or less than a guy who got on escalators of advancement. I was privileged. I had, relatively dysfunctional, functional family. I got a decent education. And in 2 generations from a migrant, people who did manual labor, people who then second generation became cops and firemen, you get an American ambassador. That's really rare as a socio-cultural experiment if you look around the world. And I buy into it. I still to this day buy into it, although I know that that sort of American dream stuff is very tattered, and I get it. But my issue had to do with a culminating issue. It wasn't one thing, but it was a riot in August of 2017 in the city of Charlottesville, where self-professed neo-Nazis and white supremacists went to protest in something called the Unite the Right rally. And tragically, a self-professed American Nazi ran his car purposely into a large crowd of counter-protesters, tragically killed a young woman. And when asked about the incident, President Trump in his first administration said there were good people or fine people on both sides. And I know that the spin machine from Jason Miller and Steve Bannon said, well, that's not what he really said. No, he did, because you can't deny what you hear. And I realized at that point, and it actually came at a very uncomfortable moment, the day he said that, I was at some public event, kissing a baby or cutting a ribbon or doing the kind of stuff ambassadors do. And the press asked me, what did the president mean when he said there were fine people on both sides? And really, for the first time in my career, I didn't have a talking point. I didn't have anything I could fastly fall back on to dodge. And I recall saying something totally inane, like, I believe the president's words speak for themselves. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Exit stage right. And I went home and I made the decision. So I left because I have, and to this day I still have, fundamental values differences with President Trump. And yeah, it was very hard because I loved what I did. I think I had one of the great blessings of my life is that I actually did something I was semi-competent at, and I had marvelous colleagues. I had my team in Panama was, kind of like going back to the mafia reference, but I was the good mafia boss, I'd like to think. I had assembled my crew. We were doing lots of stuff, and I just had some great people that I had working with me, and it was very, very difficult to leave.
Well, certainly Panama's loss as well. You leaving?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I got to be honest. There were some things I had to do that makes me, and I'm very conscious of this. In Panama, I have a bit of a bifurcated reputation. I think there are genuinely some people who appreciated the work that I tried to do, mostly to deepen our friendship, to demystify the American ambassador as pro-consul kind of thing. But I was still the American ambassador, and I was disciplined, and I implemented a couple of policies, in particular the WACED OFAC sanctions, which were highly, highly unpopular. I make light of it, but it was actually pretty serious at the time. I got burned in effigy a bunch of times outside the gate, which is a strange thing to have happen, because first thing you do is you look out at the effigy and you're like, that doesn't look like me. No, they mean some other white guy sitting inside this building. But no, so I don't know if it was Panama's loss. I will say it was certainly my loss. And as a private citizen now, it is one of the great pleasures I have to go back and hang out with my friends in Panama, because like most countries, like Colombia, like Mexico, there's just such an amazing cultural vibrancy in Latin America that, as a New York born and bred, raised American, I just find like catnip. I love it.
Wonderful. What a way to end this conversation. It has been a real pleasure speaking to you, Ambassador John Feeley, up there in Washington, D.C. I've been, speechless most of this conversation, just wanting to listen to you, because I felt letting you run with it was giving us so much more information and insight into what is going on right now, this political arena. Perhaps not inside the mind of President Trump, but indeed what his government may end up doing and what his government may be thinking at the moment. It seems very well. It's nice to know that President Molino there in Panama is maybe writing the rule book, the playbook, as you said. I think that's probably the best way of putting it. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much. We've been talking to former ambassador to Panama, U.S. ambassador to Panama, John Feeley, distinguished 28-year State Department career, a diplomat, ambassador, a senior Western Hemisphere official, an expert in Western Hemisphere affairs, officer, helicopter pilot in the Marine Corps.
All right, I'm going to interrupt. You got to stop.
That's too much.
I got to stop right there. As the Mexicans would say, ay, pero Richard, demasiado crema en los tacos. No, listen, it's very kind of you, Richard. It's a real pleasure.
It's my pleasure, John. Thank you so much. I think they'll be running this next Tuesday. So
look forward to it.
I'll do some take. But thank you so much.
Not at all. Let's stay in touch. Whenever you're up in D.C., I come down to Columbia. I forget, did we swap? It was just email, right?
Just email, but I can
send me your phone and we'll WhatsApp.
Okay, perfect.
All righty. Very good. You take care, man. Real pleasure.